And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner. Today, I am super excited to have Lindsay Currie on the channel with us, joining us to talk about her brand new book. And it is called It's Watching. And what a phenomenally fun book this is, Lindsay. I'm having so much fun reading it.
Thank
And
you.
this is how many does this make in this particular series?
So this book is actually standalone.
Okay.
So all of my what I call spooky middle grade books
Yeah.
up to date, and this would be my sixth one, I believe, that falls under the mystery but kind of paranormal mystery category.
Right.
All of them to now are standalone, so you can read them in any order. They feature different characters, different settings, different plots.
Excellent. Lindsay, I love to start a conversation with a fun question to just kind of set the tone
Okay.
and get the conversation going. And one question that I love to ask people is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I love this question. So I would say there's probably two parts to it. All right. So when I was
Okay.
very young, I wrote all the time. I really enjoyed it. I think for me, it was a nice outlet. It was really therapeutic. Right. I'm not saying that when I was a kid, I was great at writing, but it was something that felt like part of my personality. I know all of us have something that we do that makes us feel like us. For some people, it's a sport,
Hmm.
and for others, it's an art, a dance, maybe playing an instrument. For me, that was writing when I was a kid. And I was also an avid reader. I read all the time. And there are two books that stick out in my childhood as books that influenced me, both as a reader, but also in this potential kind of mindset that in the future, maybe someday I might want to write something or do something like this.
Yeah.
One of them was a spooky book that I read when I was in probably fourth grade called The Dollhouse Murders. This book is still
Mm.
out there. It has a different cover. I don't really know how well it aged, so I'm going to preface this by saying that. But when I was a kid, that was the first spooky mystery I read that genuinely scared me. It was
Mm.
really atmospheric. It was very well written. And there wasn't a ton of middle grade at the time, especially middle grade that was spooky like that. So often
Yeah.
kids in my age group would read something wholly inappropriate content wise,
Sure.
right? To kind of
Sure.
satisfy that spooky urge. And I remember thinking this was really fun. Like I knew I was in a safe environment, but I was scared. And it was such a fun experience. And that kind of started my love of spooky. When you combine that with book two, which was Where the Red Fern Grows. And I know people have such strong feelings about that book because it was sad, right?
Yes.
But that was the first book I read that I think made me feel a whole range of emotions. One minute I was happy, the next minute I was sad. I was grieving for characters, I was angry. And it really, to me, in my mind, felt like a magical power, what the author did with that book, making me feel all of those things in the span of those pages. I had never been to the Ozarks. I did not grow up in a hunting family. I knew nothing about the life I was reading about, yet I felt so included in it. And that, I think, was probably the first time with a book like that I thought, maybe someday I could learn to do something like that. I like to
Right.
write. Maybe someday I could do that and share my stories with other people.
I don't think I've ever grieved for a fictional character as much as I did for Old Dan and Little Ann.
Oh,
That
even
you know,
even
rip
I
rip
reread
my
that book.
10-year-old heart out.
Oh, I reread that book with my son when he was a kid.
Yeah.
My oldest is now 22, and he probably has PTSD from us reading it together because when we got to the end, I was so choked up that I had him read the end. Mom of the Year
Mm.
award right here, right? It's such a beautiful book, but it is heartbreaking. But
Yeah.
I received that book when I was in elementary school through a program called RIF. I don't even know if it exists anymore, but it stood for Reading is
It's
Fundamental.
fundamental. Right, right,
You
yeah.
remember that? And so that
Yeah,
was
and
the
they had TV commercials too, I think.
yes,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
got to go to the library and pick out a book off of the
Yep.
table, brand new book, and it was yours. That was it was like Christmas to me, And
Right.
that book was one I chose more than 1 year in a row because it was a paperback, and I read it until the poor little paperback cover fell off.
Mm. Yeah. Isn't it funny that, I read that book. I can't remember exactly 10 or 11. I was, 5th, 6th grade, somewhere
Mhm.
in that range. And that story, I can remember so many details. I remember like a movie playing in my mind, and I remember, I don't know, when my kids were little, and they're all grown now, but, when they were little, I think that someone made a movie, of it, and I wouldn't
I
watch
think
it.
they may have. I'm not sure. I did
Yeah.
not get up the bravery to watch that
Y
movie.
yeah, I wouldn't watch it because I didn't well, first, I didn't trust that they would handle the story properly, and I
Yeah,
didn't want my memories tainted by that,
it's
and
always a risk.
yeah, and for a book that I read 40 years ago, to have that much of an indelible mark on me, says something about I couldn't even tell you who wrote the book, and that is sad. Um
Wilson Rawls. Wilson
Wilson
Rawls.
Rawls, yes. Know nothing about Wilson Rawls, but I'm assuming it's a he. He, uh, y did magic that made me want to be a writer for
Yes.
sure. He
Yes.
he
He
and
created
Encyclopedia Brown.
something, yes, something that wormed its way into my head and into my brain, and also made me think that, and this was back in the day when we didn't have author visits at schools, right? I mean,
Sure,
I never met an author. I didn't have any signed books until I was an adult, until I was, trying to break into the publishing industry. So
sure.
it's not like we had a lot of exposure to this as a profession or a career,
Right.
or really had the opportunity to imagine ourselves doing this for a living.
Mhm.
But I do remember thinking it would be very cool to be able to write stories like this and transport other people. And, coupled with the fact that I didn't travel a lot as a kid, my family didn't have a ton of money. We were always very careful with money. So we spent most of our time inside of our city limits, and it was not a huge town. It was kind of a smaller farming community. So reading was an escape. It was a way to explore other people and places and cultures. And Wilson Rawls nailed it for me.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, what an interesting side tangent. I had no, no idea that
No,
we
you
would
got
go where the red fern grows, but I'm so happy we did. Um, when did you decide you would rather be a writer than an airline pilot?
Oh, you did your research. Okay, so um, full transparency here, I didn't actually want to be a pilot. Okay,
Mhm.
I was in flight school briefly. I was taking flying lessons in these tiny little Cessna airplanes, which was absolutely terrifying to me. But that was kind of a means to a larger goal, which for me was the FBI. I
Mm,
wanted to be a special agent in the FBI. And back in the day, really you had to have something that set you apart from others, right? Some sort of skill. I wasn't bilingual. I didn't really have a skill to offer the FBI other than my profound and intense desire to be part of it. So I said, I'm going to learn to fly planes. That is something that they are always looking for. And I tried that and I failed. I was so awful at it. I threw up while I was trying to learn. I still remember the pilot on the one day that I took off and landed on my own. They were in the airplane with me. I still remember asking, "Has anyone ever thrown up doing this? Because I feel really sick." And he was like, "No, nobody ever throws up." I'm like, "Well, get the bag ready because I'm going to be your first."
those little Cessnas are really like, Volkswagens with wings, aren't they? It's
I mean, I felt like I was trying to pilot a paper mache object, every gust of wind felt like it was going to blow us out of the air. And I am still to this day not a very good flyer.
Mhm.
So the transition between that Lindsay and the Lindsay that we have now really took place over many years, to be honest. I mean,
Yeah.
I had other jobs. I raised an entire family. I have 3 kids. So it was kind of a slow process. I think I continued writing that entire time. I didn't pursue publishing as a career until I was in my 30s, to be honest with you. Again, it was one of those things that would occur to me and sit in the back of my head and marinate. And
Mhm.
there's a certain level of courage and bravery, as you know, that is associated with sharing your words with other people. And I think it
Sure.
took me a very long time to get there.
Um, eh, Over the past decade, or a little longer than a decade, 12 years, I think, that I've been podcasting about books and writers. We've done mm, around 2,000 author interviews in that time. One thing that I've always found wildly interesting is that of those roughly 2,000 interviews, I can count probably on one hand the amount of people that their sole desire was to become a writer, and that everything, their education, their work experience was all pushing them toward getting an MFA, pursuing writing, pursuing publishing, and that's all they could ever think about. Probably five, maybe seven people out
Yeah.
of 2,000 that I've met over a decade. What I love is that for the vast majority of writers, it's a circuitous path that brings us to writing. And I often wonder, and I don't know that there's a right answer, but there's different people's experiences with it that I think is a fascinating answer to the question is, um, what is it about? Do you think that as writers we need to collect life experience that then goes into our writing? I always talk about the writer's toolkit, and as we go through life, when we go on that circuitous route, we pick up different tools that we're able to put in our writer toolkit, and that
Yeah.
we can draw upon. Um, can you in your experiences before becoming a writer, can
Yeah.
you point to any one thing in particular that you're thankful that because of that experience you have a tool in your writer toolkit?
Yeah. Well,
It was
for
a
sure.
long-winded question, I know, I'm
No, no,
sorry.
no, no. No, I see where you're going with this. And actually, I agree with you completely. I think part of it too is that above so many other industries, publishing is very mysterious, right?
Yeah,
It's the vast majority of people who I speak to. I don't usually talk a lot about being an author when I'm just out and about because
yeah,
it's something that's hard to explain, right? Like
right,
our industry
right,
works so very different from any other one. And
sure,
I think that poses some issues too in terms of breaking into it and even knowing where to start. It's overwhelming when you're first starting out and you're thinking about, well, am I going to try to do this or not? Because not only is it intimidating to think about writing a full novel, right? When perhaps in
mhm,
your past you've just written bits and pieces, right? And never really done anything with them. I mean, I can't tell you how many hundreds of bits and pieces and things probably just still live on my computer and will always live there, right? But also just not even knowing where to begin the process or having anyone really to guide you. I think that's a huge part of a stumbling block for people. And for me, like when I think back on I guess what I would call my journey, which was many years. I spent a long time getting, the no's that you hear about,
mhm,
right? I think I could
yeah,
wallpaper my whole house with those if I, could find a way to print them out. I think one of the things that has really added to my what would be my toolkit now that I
mhm,
use is really all of those no's. My children were small when I first started this process, and I recall not even really knowing where I fit in publishing. I think the first book I tried to write was actually a picture book. I had small kids, and I felt like that was the age group I knew. I didn't have an idea of what my voice was, what my niche was in the industry, if I even had somewhere that I fit. And I spent many years toiling in that same direction, not knowing that it just wasn't right.
mhm,
Hopefully, every agent that I queried back then does not remember me because I sent them things that were not ready, that
yeah,
were misguided in so many ways. But those experiences now have really, I guess they've given me like this bubble, right, around me that when
yeah,
I do have something new go out on submission, when I do have something new going over to an editor, whether or not I have a relationship with them already or not, I can kind of take it, right? If it's not right, I understand in this industry, it has to be the right book at the right place at the right time. That's
Sure.
not going to be every single book. No matter how many I have come out, it doesn't ever mean I'm going to be a sure thing, you know?
Yeah.
That's just the way it works. So I think my toolbox is a lot harder just because I'm able to have that perspective. And that was something that I didn't start out with. I had to learn that over a period of time.
Right. We had a great question in the chat from Sean, and I'm going to get to that in just a minute, Sean. So I'm not going to forget about you, but I want to set the stage a little bit before we pop over to that. Lindsay, what you talked about writing picture books in the beginning.
Mhm.
What led you to kind of where you found your home right now, and is it developing the voice? And when you started writing middle grade, how did you know that you had a voice?
Yeah.
What was it that resonated with you?
It was by accident, Hank. I mean, really what happened was an idea popped into my head. It's probably would have been around 2015 or so,
Mhm.
maybe 2014. An idea popped into my head that was a ghost story and a mystery. And I was so smitten with this idea. I knew I wanted to write something with it, but it did not feel appropriate for a picture book, nor had I broken into that, right? I was agented by that time, but I didn't have any middle grades out yet. But this felt distinctly middle grade to me. It felt adventurous. It felt like something that was going to work really, really well for that age range. And back then, I'll be honest, there weren't a ton of spooky middle grade writers. It wasn't
Yeah.
the boom that it is now. So it was still a bit of an uphill climb, but I got very, very fortunate that my agent got into the hands of a very talented editor at Simon and Schuster. Aladdin was the imprint, and that book became my first middle grade, which was The Peculiar Incident on Shady Street, and that opened a lot of doors for me. So yeah, it was kind of I could say this over and over again about so many situations for me with publishing that it was kind of a long process, right?
Yeah.
There was definitely no switch or no overnight anything for me.
Gotcha. Do you remember what that first story idea was, when you kind of settle? And that I'm gonna, dip into B's question that
Yeah.
just posted. Lindsay, how many different genres did you process through before you chose this one? I jumped from one to another and loved them all, but never settled on just one type. How did you know? And I think she's specifically talking about the kind of spooky middle grade.
Yeah, yeah.
How did you figure out that this was your jam?
So the initial well, I got the idea from seeing something. I'm a really visual person, right? And so
Mhm.
often I'm inspired by things that I see or things that I hear. I'm very into history. I love lost or forgotten history, things that people
Yeah.
don't remember or have twisted up somehow over the years.
Mhm.
Then I saw a sculpture in a graveyard when I was living in Chicago that just something
Ooh.
about it really settled under my skin. It was beautiful but scary at the same time.
Mm.
It was very haunting,
Evocative.
and yeah, I went home and started researching, and I uncovered this entire ghost story, a
Oh.
lot of ghost stories about this particular grave, and it really got me thinking about writing a mystery that featured this grave and the story of the person who was obviously a real person, who's buried there. And I have to credit my then agent, who is not now my now agent, my then agent at the
Mhm.
time, for listening to this idea and really helping me brainstorm and think about what this could be. And I think we landed on middle grade together, which was exciting, but was also scary because out of pretty much all the genres, and B, this kind of answers your question a little bit, out of pretty much all the genres, that was the one I had not tried. All right. I had not tried writing anything middle grade. I didn't, I actually read quite a lot of middle grade because by this point, my kids were in middle grade, right?
Right.
We're somewhere between fourth and seventh grade. And so I took a stab at it and it felt very natural. It felt very organic, unlike some of the other things I've been trying to write, where I think looking back now, I realized I was kind of trying to force myself into a space I didn't quite fit in and wasn't comfortable in. Writing in a middle grade voice was really comfortable for me.
Gotcha. That's a perfect setup for Sean's question that he posted a minute ago. I wrote my debut middle grade spooky mystery novel during NaNoWriMo this past year, but I'm still kind of stuck on a title. How'd you come up with yours? And do you have any tips on making them spooky yet eye-catching?
So that's a great question, Sean. And I'm going to be completely honest. I am not great at titles. Okay. Titles are a real weak spot for me. Out of the six spooky middle grades, I have seven mysteries out, but six that I would categorize as spooky.
Wow.
I would say that I've been able to keep one title that was an original title, meaning that my publisher has come in and very gently and very kindly said, this isn't quite as good as it could be. Let's brainstorm and see if we can get it to that point. So for all of my titles, I could give you a previous title, that was something of mine that now in hindsight is a little bit lame, right? And isn't as great or make the reader as curious as they should be about the story. So what I would say about titles is I wouldn't worry about having a working title that's going to be permanent. If you are
Mhm.
comfortable with what you have, and you go on submission with that title, if you have an agent who's comfortable with it, cool. Just be flexible and know that your publisher may come in at some point and say, we have to brainstorm a little bit because we don't think this is checking all the boxes.
Gotcha. Um, I mentioned earlier Encyclopedia Brown because that's one of those indelible series that have stuck with me and made me want to write mysteries. And looking back with an adult's eyes on Encyclopedia Brown, just as an example, um, the books that I remember picking up at the Scholastic Book Fair,
Mhm.
at school were probably a collection of short stories, bound together across a theme, if I remember right.
Mhm.
But I remember specifically, I remember several stories, but there was one that really stuck with me. And Encyclopedia Brown was a kid who his dad was the sheriff or a sheriff's deputy, if I remember right,
I think I
and he would
remember
always
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
he would tag along with his dad, and he would
Yeah.
notice things that the adults overlooked, and there was one story in particular, and I'm going somewhere with this, I promise.
I
But
believe.
yeah, there was one story about, someone who the police were after, and they go to his house, and, the guy tells Encyclopedia Brown's dad that, "Oh, I just got home. I just drove up. I wasn't here when so and so happened." And
Mm,
he had a toddler on the hood of the car, just kind of sitting there, walking around or
okay.
whatever. And Encyclopedia Brown says, "Well, you didn't just get home because, the hood would be too hot, and the baby wouldn't be able to just sit on the hood.
Mhm.
Therefore, the car's been here all day. You've been here. You didn't just get here," or whatever. The details don't matter. But what my point is that that opened something in me, because this character, this kid, used deductive reasoning and thought outside the box, and the writer, whoever the writer of those stories was, didn't take for granted that because I was a kid, I didn't deserve to have a good mystery with a clever solution.
Yeah.
And so my point to all that is, um, people misjudge middle grade, especially, I think. And I think when they think about writing middle grade, they think it's just writing silly stories.
Yeah.
But no, you do have to be just as clever as a writer. You have to not take the reader's intelligence for granted, and you don't need to spoon feed them um, silly, easy stories just because they're young.
Right.
But there is a craft to couching those stories in a way that is appropriate for their age, not
Yes.
just easy.
Yeah.
So I say all that to say, as a writer of middle grade mysteries and spooky mysteries, how do you remain clever and challenge these readers while not going off the deep end with inappropriate content
Yeah.
for their age?
Well, I think there's two different things there. Because for one, first of all, I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying. I mean, I'm in a lot of schools throughout the year. A big
Mhm.
part of my job anymore is school visits, which means I get to spend a lot of time with middle grade readers. They are very smart. And
Yeah.
honestly, I feel like for whatever reason, they are a lot more clever or worldly than I ever was at that age.
Mhm.
They surprise me at almost every single visit with a comment or a question or something that they pick up from a book of mine. Maybe it's an obscure Easter egg to something else, right? And they will find it, they will see it. So for me, I try to write fairly complicated mysteries for them because I think they can handle that. And the way that I temper it for this age range is to make sure that there's also a fair number of clues in there, right? Because the number of clues and where they're placed and how overt that clue is really
Yeah.
important for the age group. They don't need every little single thing spelled out. They can connect dots, they can see from point A to point B, right? But if you do give them too few clues or they are too random or obscure, then that's certainly going to be maddening for them, and I think you're going to lose your audience a little bit. So I don't really curb the I guess complexity of the mystery itself. In fact, it's
Mhm.
watching, I think, might be one of my most complex mysteries. I mean, there is a large amount of genealogy in this book, and it takes some effort, I think, to follow along in research with my characters, as they're kind of like untangling the mystery. It is going to be something that middle graders are going to have to focus to do. And then the other kind of part of this is like, in terms of making sure the content is okay. I kind of think about that in terms of like edge factor and fear factor. And for me, it's kind of, after all these years, there's kind of an innate feeling that goes along with it. If I am writing a scary scene, or, I don't write, I should preface this by saying to anyone listening, I don't write any gore in any of my books. So
Mhm.
there isn't going to be blood. There isn't even going to be splatters of blood. That's really not what I do in my books. My books are, yes, often labeled as horror, but generally it's because there is a paranormal element and kind of more classic horror scares than gore.
Right.
Um, and when I'm writing those scenes, I really can feel if I'm getting close to that line, right? My goal is to yes, scare a little bit because that's fun and that's part of my
Mhm.
job, right? But it's not to traumatize, and it's also not to really detract fully from the mystery. So I think it's kind of a delicate balance, I mean, I love this question that you asked because it's something that I feel like I have to find with every single book.
Gotcha. B had a great comment. Not all middle grade readers are created equal. They aren't jaded by life and still have an open mind. You're
Yep,
absolutely right.
absolutely. And they're still up for an adventure,
Yeah.
I mean, they are ready to throw themselves into a story like this, into a mystery like this. And specifically with its watching too. I mean, because there's so much history in my books. I mean, I don't know that students know in advance and young readers know in advance when they pick up one of my books that they're going to get so much history, but that's such a part of my identity and things that I like. But with its watching, I mean, we have so much front matter and back matter for them to kind of follow along with. I mean, there
Mhm.
is an incredible, I'm holding the paperback, but side note for everyone watching or listening, It's Watching did come out in paperback and hardback simultaneously on the same day. But we have an incredible map in here. And then there's
Yeah.
actual photos of the graveyard in the book at the end of the book as well. And what that allows middle grade readers to do is it allows them to throw themselves into the story. Yes, thank you. Oh, good. You're
Yeah.
holding the hardback.
Yeah.
Throw themselves into the story, into the adventure, into the mystery, but also become involved, right? Do their own research along with my characters. Don't just be a passive observer to what's happening, but kind of be a part of it.
Yeah. Um, d- Folks are confused a lot of times about what exactly makes a book middle grade, and what's the difference in middle grade and young adult, because I feel like young adult has skewed more adult than young adult in
Yeah.
maybe the last decade or so, and middle grade seems to have kind of held its place. What makes a book middle grade, and what are some of the hallmarks that when you're writing you need to make sure, what are some boundaries, if we can say it like
Yeah.
that, that you set for yourself, that
Yeah.
if I'm writing to this audience, I don't need to stray too far this way. I don't need to get into this subject matter, but kind of what are the boundaries that you set for yourself?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I think that a lot of young adult is really a kind of a crossover age. You know, you have a lot of adults
Right.
reading young adult, maybe even more than teens themselves reading it. Middle grade for me, I kind of look at middle grade as two pieces. You know, I think there's a lot of younger middle grade, so lower MG, and then I think there is an upper middle grade that actually does kind of skirt the line between middle grade and young adult. For me, I think probably given the length of my books, the age of my characters, the content, mine are probably more along the upper middle grade area, but there are still huge differences between middle grade and young adult that I always keep in mind when I'm writing. So probably the biggest one for me is that middle grade for me should and always will have hope. Um, there was always a ribbon of hope. As awful as some of the things are that I do to some of my characters, I am never going to end one of my books with, and then they all die, right? Or something. Will the ending be perfect? No, because life is rarely ever perfect for any of
Right.
us, but there will be a ribbon of hope in all of my books. The other thing I'm very careful with is romantic side, stories. Because for this particular age range, while they may be ready to read some of that, they're certainly not ready to read all of it, nor does
Right.
it appeal to all middle grade readers. So I really limit myself there. There may be a budding crush, right? There may be some hand holding. There may be this clear beginning of a thought that, this maybe I feel differently about this person than I thought I did, but I keep it pretty contained,
Mhm.
so that it does still fall within the middle grade realm.
Gotcha. Sean asked a great question, and I feel like this is a great segue into what I want to ask next about how you promote yourself as a writer
Mhm.
to an audience of people that don't typically buy books. They're not
Yeah.
capable of buying books
Yeah.
yet. But we'll tackle Sean's question first. Have you gotten any interesting advice from kids from your school visits regarding your books? What kind of feedback do you get from kids, and what is it like connecting with readers of this age?
It's so fun. I mean, honestly, school visits for me, although they can be tiring, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of travel is tiring. But I think at the end of the day, when I go into school visits and I get to hang out the entire day with a bunch of readers that are excited about my books or excited to read my books, even if they've never read one, it's a fantastic reminder of why I do what I do, right? Publishing is not always ups. There's a lot of downs. There's a lot of challenging times. And I think being able to hang out with readers balances out those challenging times. It gives me kind of that fuel and energy to come back in here into my office, pound at the keyboard and get that next book going or finish that next book or, whatever it is. And yes, often when I'm in schools, I'll have kids because they do love to be part of the process.
Yeah.
Um, I'll have them say things like, "Have you heard of this place?" "Oh, I've heard it's haunted." And they'll
Mhm.
give me all of these things to research. And so, yeah, I do. I love their feedback. I love hearing their feedback and their excitement and their ideas.
When most writers, if you're traditionally published, like you are, the publisher tends to have a staff of people in promotions that will help set up things like we're doing here today with author interviews and to get you as the author, get you out so that people get their eyes on you and understand what you do, and hopefully connect with readers that will help build your career and your brand as an author, and all of that great stuff. Um, and that is a proven technique over and over for most writers, especially if you're writing adult fiction, because the people you're generally talking to can then flip over to Amazon and purchase that book, or go down to their local bookstore and buy a book. Well, when you're talking about 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 year olds, they typically don't have credit cards and can't drop, but they do have book fairs, and I don't know if reading is fundamental is still a thing, but they have programs like that, or school libraries where they can get um, eh, you know uh, familiarized with an author.
Mhm.
But as the author who's in the trenches here, uh, how do you go about getting your work out to readers that will connect with them? Are you trying to connect with parents and grandparents who will hopefully have influence? Like, how do you think about promoting your work? And promoting your work is kind of such a dirty word, but I mean, that's what you're doing. You're trying to
Yeah.
get, I've created this thing. I want you to see it. How
Yeah.
do you think about getting the thing that you spent so much time and care creating in front of the people that you want to read it?
Well, you make a good point. I mean, middle grade is in specific over all of the other age groups too. It's really filled with a lot of gatekeepers, is the way I look
Yeah.
at it, right? Because kids really aren't buying their own books. And they're not reading school library journal, they're not reading book lists, they're not checking it, Kirkus, to see what reviews are looking like for upcoming
Right.
books. But what they do have is a lot of very savvy, very passionate educators, right? So we
Right.
have librarians. I credit librarians with a humongous chunk of any success I've ever had with any book. Because when you get in front of librarians and when they decide to support your book and promote it to their students in whatever way that is, maybe it's a read aloud, maybe it's just doing a book talk on that book. That is how you reach your reader, right? Because you're going to show up in school libraries, you're going to show up in classroom libraries. Kids are going to want to go get that book for themselves because they don't want to wait for the 12 holds that are ahead of them in the library. It's really about reaching the people who are front facing to your readers, because we're not always going to be front facing to them, right? The
Sure.
vast majority of my followers on most social media, which anymore is like, because we've all scattered and we don't know where
Right.
anybody is. We don't know what platform to be on or if it's going to
Right.
exist the next day. But the majority of them are educators. They're not actually my readers, right? They're the educators who are looking for that next great thing that they can share with their students to hopefully get them excited about reading. So I focus a lot of my marketing and I guess, any pitching that I do about my books really on librarians and teachers, because they're the ones that are going to help me get in front of my readers.
Have you learned any strategies over the 10 books or so that you've published, that you, just like with anyone, you have a blip to grab someone's attention? Or are there things that you have learned that if I do something a certain way, this librarian, this teacher, I'll pique their interest? Or are there things that you've
I,
learned?
I don't really think it's like a specific thing. I think that
Mhm.
you need to build up trust in that specific community, because
Yeah.
educators and librarians in particular are facing so many hurdles.
Yeah.
They have to be so careful what they have in their libraries. New things are banned every other day. It really is a harrowing job anymore, which is just, it's disappointing on so many levels. But what I have tried really hard to do, and I would encourage any author to do the same thing, is don't just look at one book as that book. Look at how it fits in your career as a whole and how it fits into your brand and what are you trying to accomplish. So I have spent many years trying to build up trust with educators and librarians, that I'm not just writing things to just scare their students, that
Right.
there are also deeper themes that they can have conversations about in classes. There are a lot of family, friendship, bravery, empathy, all of these big important themes, and a huge dose of history that can also be discussed. And when you build up that trust, right, which is not a super fast process, but still
Mhm.
really important, you start seeing your books turn up as nominations on, state book award lists, right? And these are things that create tremendous exposure for every
Sure.
single book, right? I have books that have been on 20 plus states, over the course of the years, just that one title. And the reality of that is that you're getting support from those educators, you're getting support from those librarians. They're the ones nominating the titles, but the people actually voting are the readers. It's the kids. And so you are building up new readers, right, through that process. So I guess I wish that there was like a way for me to say there's like a quick and easy way to, to endear yourselves to the education community. And I really think it's more about proving yourself than that, right? Consistently putting out thoughtful material for their students and their readers.
Excellent. B says, you try to tantalize, not terrorize, as well as educate a reader. Is that how you see it, Lindsay?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, do I want there to be a considerable fear factor in my books? Absolutely, because
Right.
that is part of my spooky, I'm not
Yeah.
wearing this, skull and crossbones sweater for nothing here. Like I do, that
Right.
is my goal. But also, there is a certain level of education that's happening in my books that, while it's certainly not, hit them over the head with it, I like the idea of getting students interested in history and especially thinking about how research doesn't have to be this dull, your eyes glaze over thing, right? Every time I write a mystery, the characters are slowly picking away at these clues. So students really are learning kind of how to problem solve, how to handle things. They're learning about friendship dynamics too. There's always a lot of that in my books. There's a lot with family and family engagement and parents and all of that. So I think everything when it comes together, right? I don't want my books to be able to be categorized in just one way. Like this book is just a scary book. I want it to be scary, but I also want it to be heartwarming in places. I
Yeah.
also want it to be thoughtful. I want it to be deep and layered.
I love it. Let's get off of selling books for a minute. Let's talk about the craft of writing.
Mhm.
Um, one thing that I love to ask people, and I love to hear about each writer's individual process because it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
But at one moment, a book like It's Watching does not exist. This book is it doesn't exist. It hasn't been created yet. And then either a character like Josie walks onto the stage of your mind, and you're like, "Well, who is Josie, and what is she up to?" And then her two friends, Jackson and Allison, walk out, and you're like, "Well, now we've got these three kids. What are they up to?" Um, and you maybe start asking what if questions, or some people interview characters like, who are you and what are you about, and different people have different ways of getting to it, but or maybe you've collected some interesting facts, some ghost stories, if you will, about a particular place, and so that's in your mind somewhere, and then you think, well, what if Josie discovered this thing, and then what would happen? How would the ghost story unravel for Josie, or whatever, and
Yeah.
then through these series of questions that you ask, or imaginations, um, then the story is is born somehow, and it starts as a kernel of an idea, and then it grows, and the more you ask and the more you imagine, and all of this, then on some level It's Watching does exist, and then it's your job as the writer to dig it up and excavate it and dust it off and
Yeah.
whip it into shape, and then we have a book in our hand. What is that first moment of creation like for you, with that first kernel of an idea that then grows into something? Where does it begin for you?
Oh, it's so chaotic.
Mm. I
I
love
I
the chaos
I
of it.
think I'm probably the most chaotic writer, in the world because I think I mentioned before that I'm very visual. So what will happen to me is I generally I'll see something,
Mhm.
that is spooky or interesting or something that maybe it's something that just doesn't fit, right? Something that sticks out to me for some reason. And my imagination always goes to what is the story behind that thing, right? Everything has a story if you take the time to read about it or research it, right? And so usually my setting kind of comes before anything. Or this one thing, right? And then I build out from there. I really have never had a situation where the first thing that occurred to me were the characters. Characters always kind of come secondary for me. But the setting, the atmosphere, and sometimes even the ghosts themselves, right? I mean, I may be reading. I've relocated, but I lived for 20 some years in Chicago, and I would spend a lot of time at the Chicago History Museum, and they have this incredible research room. And attendants who can help you find just about anything related to Chicago over the years. And I may just be reading an article about an event from a long time ago and discover a name, and that sends me on a different tangent, right? Like, who was that person? What did they do? What is their story? So with It's Watching, I was actually at a school visit, and I had a teacher, she was talking about my spooky stories and how some of them feature, actual graveyards like Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, or the Showman's Rest section of the graveyard in It Found Us. And she said, when I was a kid, we used to sneak into this graveyard called Bachelor's Grove, and it was terrifying. And I was like, Bachelor's Grove. So I was like, so that's near here? She was like, oh, it's about 10 minutes away. So now that's in my head, right? So the next thing I have to do is go to this graveyard and see if it feels like something I want to work with. And Bachelor's Grove did not disappoint. I mean, it is old. It is largely abandoned. Out of the over, 80 or 100 people buried there, there's barely 20 headstones. Many of them are destroyed. They're tipped over. The majority are missing. It's really it's just a strange and unsettling thing to see and experience. And I knew the second I actually saw it in person that I needed to feature it in a book. And from there, I started building the story and figuring out who the characters were going to be based on what I wanted to say about that setting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Are you a hardcore planner? When you before the drafting starts, how much of a plan do you put together? Do you hold all of it in your head? Are you writing completely in the dark? What's your process like?
I would love to be a planner.
Yeah.
I am so jealous of authors who can plot. I mean, I on Instagram, I'll see pictures of people with their, their cork boards and all of their, Post-it notes lined up and all that. That is just not the way I function well. And I have tried it many times. I cannot do it that way. For me, when I start a book, I know where the book's going to start. I know my characters and their goals. I need to know what they want, right? Because I cannot put things in their way if I don't know what their goals are. And I have a pretty good idea of how I want things to end, but all of that in the middle is up for question. It's a gray area for me. And so I generally feel my way around the plot as I write. It's, for me, the most organic way for stories to come out, but it also means that my stories require a lot of second guessing and editing as I write, without having a roadmap. Sometimes I will veer a direction and then decide, oops, I took a wrong turn. This isn't right. Got to back up and figure it out again. But that has been the way that I've written all of my stories. And I think it's really just my process at this point.
Gotcha. Sean says, has your trail of clues ever run dry or gotten flat? And if so, how do you enliven the clues to make them more exciting to the story? That's a great question.
That is a great question. And honestly, it happens to me a lot where, because every clue you put in a book, right, you are going to have to come back and resolve that somehow, unless it is a red herring of some type. And even that you have to resolve in some way. So for my clues,
or at least prove why it's not a thing.
Exactly. You have to address it somehow. So I'm pretty careful with my clues. I don't really just throw them in kind of willy-nilly. And honestly, like, if I put a clue in that, and I know it sounds a little bit like a cop-out, but it's genuinely true with me. If I put a clue in that just doesn't feel right to me at the time, or I can't see a clear vision for why I'm putting it there, whether or not it's the most interesting clue. Look, it could be a broken stick on a trail, right? Like it could be a partial footprint somewhere. It could be whatever it is. It doesn't have to be the most unique clue. But for me, the key is making sure that I have a clear vision for what that clue could mean or does mean to my characters and how it's going to play out in terms of them figuring out the mystery.
Yeah. And that feel that you develop as a writer, the more you write, the more you publish, the more you go through the process, the starting with a blank page, ending with a book, when you write a beginning, middle, and end, that feel takes on a tangible quality at some point.
Yes.
Like it's
Yes.
yeah, it feels kind of ethereal, kind of kind of woo woo. But it becomes part
It's
of the
true
process.
though.
You
It
know
is.
what works and what doesn't. Yeah.
And it's hard. I think what's hard about that is for things like this, it's very hard to explain,
Yeah.
because saying, well, it just feels right seems like such a cop out. But I think over time, you do figure out what feels right and what feels off in some
Yeah.
way, right? And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that the off things can never be included. It's just that maybe they need to be changed up a little bit.
Yeah. You talked about having kids that were, the appropriate age that when you began writing middle grade, and you were surrounded by people that talked this way, and that got into, the things that middle graders get into. But as your children have aged and you are no longer kind of surrounded by them, how do you stay in touch with the feelings of middle graders, just to stay kind of connected to that reader group?
I It's partially a joke and partially not, but sometimes I feel like I didn't really graduate beyond 12 in my heart somehow.
Yeah.
I it's just that it's such a unique time of life.
Yeah.
You've got one foot in childhood, one foot in adulthood. You don't know who you are. It's very awkward, but also exciting. And I remember it so vividly, right? I
Yeah.
think we all remember those years pretty vividly. And I think that's what keeps me able to write for this age group. And really, it's probably why I was able to write for this age group in the beginning, right? I mean, yes, I was always surrounded by my kids and they had their friends in the car, and I a tremendous eavesdropper. So I would always be listening in on, what are they talking about? How are they talking? Like, what are their interactions like? But I also think a lot of it too is just that's the time of life that I remember probably most vividly out of my childhood were those years. And so it's very easy for me to recall those things. And not only that, but there are so many things that happen in our middle grade years that are kind of classic, meaning
Mhm.
can kind of they speak to a lot of people across the board, right? Like the
Yeah.
feelings that we have, the feelings that, we don't know where we fit in, the feelings that, oh, this friend of mine is suddenly wearing makeup. I'm not allowed to. I wouldn't even know how to put that on. Or, why did all of these people go to a sleepover and no one told me about it? And those things are even more enhanced now because now we have social
Right.
media. So we can see where everyone is and what they're doing. So I feel like with it being that vivid in my mind, and with them all being such big themes that still apply to all of us, today that we remember and can identify with, that helps me a lot when I'm writing.
It's fantastic. It's Watching is out and available everywhere now. It came out a couple of days ago. Lindsay Currie, this is such a great book. I love it. I love
Thank
everything
you.
that you're doing. If folks are just discovering you and want to dig into, your great back catalog and tune in for news of upcoming projects and all of that, is there a central place on? We talked about how social media is so scattered and stuff now,
Yeah.
but is there a central place where it is a good place to go follow you and stay tuned for news?
Absolutely. I would go to my website, which is lindsaycurrie.com. Honestly, I work with multiple publishers. So while you could try to chase me down through the publisher website, all of the information about my books, what the books are about, where you can find them, where you can order signed copies, all that kind of thing is on my website, as well as new news and what's coming for me in the future. So find my website. And I think that's probably the best place to get it all.
Excellent. We'll add links to that in the show notes of this episode. Lindsay, this has been so much fun chatting. I
Thank
feel like we
you.
could talk all day. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was a really good time.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Bye bye. Thank you.